I think what makes America really exceptional on the global stage is that our Constitution does not grant us rights. It recognizes our inalienable rights by birth, and then gives very specific limited powers to our government to do certain specific tasks. Anything that's not explicitly granted as a power to the government is reserved to the states and then reserved to the people. And so we end up in this really surreal situation where the rule of law has essentially been tossed out the window. And we know this because the Supreme Court has now ruled 5 separate times that California has unlawfully infringed on the rights of people to worship in their church in their way. I mean, what is more basic than that, than the right to worship, the right to peaceful assembly, the right to travel freely? And so we end up in this really bizarre situation where now we have essential and non-essential workers, essential and non-essential businesses. All of the stuff that's being done, most of it, is essentially unlawful. And the problem that we're facing is until the Supreme Court steps in and rules that it is in fact unlawful, as they have done on the churches and some other things at this point, we're in completely out of the land of the rule of law and into twilight zone, essentially. So my name is Vladislav Davidson. I'm a 20-year tech executive with multiple successful exits. I do data analytics professionally. That's one of the things I do, is I analyze massive amounts of data for ads and so on. So when this happened back in March, I started looking and I started asking the question. I was looking and basically looking at the data from the Princess Diamond ships. I was looking at data from South Korea before the lockdown started. And I was trying to understand, are we dealing with Ebola here? Are we dealing with something that's fundamentally a real threat? And it very quickly became apparent to me that in South Korea, where they had over 100,000 people tested at that time, on the Princess Diamond ship, USS Princess Diamond, where they had 100% testing capacity, they had a case fatality rate, meaning the number of people that got the disease versus the number of people who have died was below 0.6 CFR. We now know that the CFR was around 0.2, 0.3 on COVID. So I knew that from that point on, it would never be any higher than that. So I looked at it and I said, this is not Ebola. I believe Ebola has something like an 8% case fatality rate or something along those lines. And I was looking at the data early on and I said, no, this doesn't make any sense. And then the lockdowns came in. And I'm asking myself, what happened here? Because if I can analyze the data and see it this way, surely intelligence agencies around the planet are looking and coming up with the same conclusion as I am and saying that doesn't make any sense. And so we're kind of in this, we end up in this really surreal twilight zone realm where it's basically a fog of war is what we're dealing with. I think that's a really good analogy, because I've done human rights work internationally and I've worked in a war zone. To me, what I'm seeing right now pretty much looks like a war zone, except the buildings are still standing, the supply chain is still in place, but psychologically, everything is a fog. We can't tell up from down right now, and there is a massive culture of fear that's being pushed upon us, where the government is essentially pushing this narrative of, if you're breathing, you're now in danger or you're a threat to other people, and you have to wear these face diapers and take all these vaccines. And there's a lot of questions, obviously, that we have to start asking about what's kind of going on here, about the vaccinations, about our civil liberties, and about our government and the proper role of government defending civil liberties, and how we've gone off of that track to this other thing that's kind of taking us down the road of different forms of socialism.
So you said you grew up in a war zone, and what you're seeing reminds you of war.
I had done human rights work internationally, and I've operated in a war zone environment doing human rights work, intervention. And what you see in the war situation is you see a fog where there is massive fog. It's called fog of war. It's such a massive confusion, intentionally or unintentionally generated, where there's all these different players who are doing all these different things, and you have to try to figure out what is actually going on while under extreme psychological stress. So fight, flight, freeze is all the time because your life is in danger. And what we're seeing here is that same kind of fight, flight, freeze interaction going on psychologically, where the government is putting forward messaging that's putting people in that psychological state. And that state fundamentally disorients people. That's what it, at its core, that's what it does. And that's why special forces and people who train in all sorts of optimum performance worlds generally train themselves to break through that fight, flight, or freeze. And to not to stay out of freeze in particular, because when you freeze up in a war zone situation, you die. When you freeze up in this sort of situation that we're facing right now, you lose your civil liberties.
Yeah.
That's basically what we're facing here.
And eventually, you could face death.
Right.
Right. If we lose our liberties,
Right. That's a very important point. That
Yeah.
losing liberties means people die ultimately.
Yeah.
That's what history shows. Whether it's Nazi Germany, whether it's the Soviet Russia with their gulags, whether it's China, wherever communism has been tried, it hasn't gone so well, to put it mildly.
And you've had experience living under communism.
I was born in the former Soviet Union, yeah, and so to me, I think my family didn't immigrate across the planet in order to see America turn into Gulag America. I just don't think, I think that there's a lot of confusion right now in terms of what America is and who we are as a country, and I think that's a big dialogue we're having right now. And there's this question here that there's a big movement to try to demonize America, and we don't have exactly the perfect record on human rights. Like any nation, we've made our mistakes, but there's a reality about America, which is that people from across the planet want to come here because there's something about America that's fundamentally different, and that something is our Constitution. Because as far as I'm aware, there is not really. I have not seen other countries where the basic rights of the person are recognized by birth. And then the power dynamic is that the government gets only certain powers to basically defend those rights. That is the basic notion of America. The basic notion of America is that our government exists to defend our basic liberties. It doesn't exist for all the other things it's doing. It's great, but that's not its job. Its job is to defend our basic rights and liberties. And that's being challenged, it's being systemically torn down, and it's being turned on its head where the government right now is the #1 threat to our liberties, because that goes right back to the whole shutting down businesses, shutting down churches, limiting public free speech. I mean, this whole thing that came down in North Carolina, I don't know if you remember this, early on in March, there was a protest against the lockdowns. I think it might have been April or so. And the Raleigh Police Department came out and said protest is a non-essential activity. Excuse me, the founders of this country are rolling over in their graves. Protest is a non-essential activity. Whatever happened to the Boston Tea Party? So we're in a really challenging time. And I think one of the things that's true for me is because I wasn't born here in this country, I don't take the rights that I think a lot of people take for granted. I don't take them for granted because I know what it's like to live without those rights. I know what it's like to not have freedom of speech, to have a government that lies to you. I mean, like the Soviets had 70 years of lies nonstop. And that's kind of where we're headed right now, whereas all this propaganda, and like we were talking before, the media machinery that's basically parroting the line of the government, this is all really, really problematic and really scary times we're living in.
It sounds like you're in a very unique position. Most Americans don't know anything about communism. We're used to being free, or to an extent, and you're coming from a position where you've actually experienced it, and you can see the pattern, right?
Right.
Probably a lot clearer than most Americans can. Can you explain a little bit more the difference between your perception growing up under communism, coming to America, having a appreciation for these rights, and probably what most Americans you see around here? Yeah,
I think that's a really good question. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine a few days ago, and his father apparently had passed a few years ago, and his father was an immigrant, I believe, from Poland. And he said something to me. He said his dad always taught him that you never give an inch to the government, because once you lose your rights, you don't get them back voluntarily. And I think that basic wisdom that I think a lot of Europeans in particular understand because of our history, whether it's Soviet Union, whether it's Nazi Germany, whether it's all of these different the European wars and so on. The issue here is that once we surrender our liberties to the government, there is no reason to think that they're going to give them back to us. And for some reason, I think a lot of Americans have the idea that, well, COVID is here and then we're going to have a vaccine and then everything is going to go back to normal. Well, here is the problem with that. You have people in power who have basically figured out a giant hole to our whole system of checks and balances, and that hole is this notion of medical tyranny. It's like, the way that emergency powers are justified is either when there's a war, when there's some sort of external threat, which we currently really don't have, and we really haven't had for a long time, other than, of course, terrorism, which is a whole other conversation. But they figured out that there's this hole that justifies emergency powers, which is the medical emergency. And we haven't really seen that very much. I mean, the flu epidemic of 1918 might be an example, but not to the same extent that what we saw here, where massive shutdowns were ordered, where basic civil liberties were just set aside. And there's this idea that I think a lot of people hold that, gee whiz, well, we're going to get the vaccine, or the virus is going to pass, and all of a sudden we're going to be back to normal. Well, I'm sorry, the people in power now understand that they can get extraordinary powers just by saying, oh, gee, there's a new virus out here, the new variant, COVID 119, or whatever the latest thing is that they have going on, and I just don't believe fundamentally that we're going to go back to normal. I don't think there's going to be a time when our government is going to say, oh yeah, gee whiz, here's your rights back. And I think that basic reality is what makes my perspective, and I think a lot of people that I'm talking to who weren't born here, it's interesting, a lot of Russian immigrants are stepping up and saying, this is crazy. Like, you go down this road, you're not coming back from it. It's like, what is that quote, that you can vote your way into socialism, but then you have to fight your way back out? I mean, this is just not, I think once civil liberties are surrendered, they're not gotten back without a war, and we do not want to have to shed blood in order to get our liberties back. That's what this is fundamental about, and I think a lot of Americans just take their rights for granted. They think this is just kind of how it is, and it's like, and I think a big percentage of Americans have never traveled abroad. So if you haven't traveled abroad, you haven't traveled to socialist countries, you haven't been to third world nations, you just take everything we have here for granted. It's like, of course you have electricity, of course you have water, of course you have food at the market. Like, those are products of capitalism. Those are products of our market economy. And without that market economy, we lose all of those things. And the capitalism and free markets and liberty are inherently intertwined. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. They don't understand that without our capitalist economy, we're not going to have the liberties that we have. And the more you have the government stepping in, and the more interference, the social programs, the more funding you have, the more you make people dependent on government, the less liberty you're going to have. And I think those sorts of things are just not concepts that Americans really understand, because of our poor educational system, but also because of just lack of context. It's like the quote that good times make for weak men, weak men make for bad times make for strong men again, strong men make for good times. And the cycle repeats. And I think we've been in a good time for a long time, and people have become complacent and weak. And these are all challenges that we have to face, together with the corruption that we're dealing with.
I know you have experience in marketing. How have you seen the government use marketing and media as a tool for, I guess you could say, psychological warfare on American citizens? Do you have insight into that?
Yeah, so I think everything comes back to the fight, flight, freeze point. And so the inception point is fear. That was the first step, is generate fear of this virus that's supposedly going to kill people. I mean, I don't know if you remember, back in March, it was like 16% of the people were going to die. I mean, like, there was no reason to believe that. There was never any data that actually suggested that kind of reality. We had all these crazy models. So the marketing started with the modeling by a European scientist, I'm spacing on his name, but who created these models saying that, millions and millions and millions and hundreds of millions of people are going to die unless you do these lockdowns, and the lockdowns are going to magically solve everything. So we started out with a generation of fear, and that propagated into the mask wearing. So now you're wearing a physical device on your face that you're seeing people wearing around you, and so the mask fundamentally propagates the message that breathing is dangerous. There's this invisible threat all around us. That's part A. And part B is that you're a threat to other people because you're breathing. I mean, so this is basic
And
psychology.
fear and guilt.
Fear and guilt, right?
Right.
And so
Through false information.
false information,
Yeah.
and then but this piece about the marketing machinery where it was like, no, you don't wear a mask to protect yourself. In fact, the masks don't actually do much to protect you. They do everything to protect other people. So the psychology of that, like the marketing machinery, psychology that's being used through this is just incessant and horrendous.
Yeah.
And yeah, this has absolutely been a marketing machinery that's also put out completely false data. I mean, again, if back in March I was able to look at the data and say, gee, the case fatality rate was never going to be higher than 0.6%, well, every intelligence agency around the world was looking at that same data. This is public information, and they have way more information than we do. So, like, there is a lot going on here that's much worse than just straight up a mistake. I mean, we're dealing with some pretty serious propaganda and different goals. I mean, it's hard to understand the whole web of what we're facing because there's so many different players with so many different agendas. We have China over here doing their thing. Of course, it's not lost on anyone that the virus originated in China, for good or for bad. You know, you have Russia with their agendas. You have all of these different countries, all these different players trying to exploit this virus for their own need, for their own goals. And the American government is no different. American government said, well, we're going to exploit it for our goals. The Democrats were going to exploit it for this goal. The Republicans were going to do something else. And trying to make sense of that, this is the fog of war. This is exactly the fog of war. It's really, there's so many players, there's so much chaos, and it's just hard to understand what's going on. And there's huge machinery, marketing machinery behind all of this. I mean, how many tens and hundreds of millions of dollars is China spending to brandish their image and their side of the story in this? And the way they're doing it, it's not the kind of marketing that we're used to, where you see ads in magazines. It's the kind of marketing that they're planting stories with journalists. And they're telling the journalists what kind of stories to investigate or to write. You know, it's that kind of much more insidious marketing that we're seeing more and more of. And we got state players, we got the smaller fish like George Soros and some of these other guys who are big, you know, they have billions of dollars to play with, but they're much smaller than the state machinery. And then you have our own governments. And then you have, you know, and then you have the local small governments like Shasta County, for example, where I think a lot of local governments saw COVID and they said, holy smokes, we have this $500 million pension hold because we haven't been paying into the pension funds the way we promised our employees we would, or we made promises that we couldn't ever keep. Well, gee, now that we have this wonderful virus here, horrible virus, and I doubt they said it's wonderful, but you know, this horrible virus, we're going to get all this federal money that can allow us to plug the pension hole, you know. And so you start looking at some of this stuff, and that's a fog of war. That's a confusion with all of these different angles that's going on here.